Geoff Dyer's reading this afternoon is really a twofer. It's kind of like, I don't know, like that old Doublemint commercial. You're two mints in one. Am I the only person? I'm the only person who remembers that. All right, there we go. Geoff's reading this afternoon is part of our Distinguished Writer Series, and I just want to remind you that the series continues. The end of the month, November 27th, we will have Matt Johnson and Tracy Smith reading. That was the reading that was originally scheduled for the end of October and was postponed because of the hurricane. So November 27th. The reading also serves as the third event in a three-part series that we have devoted to celebration of Andrei Tarkovsky's film Stalker. Is that correct? Turn to my Russian colleagues. And I want to thank my colleagues in Russian and also Cinema and Media Studies for collaborating to help put on that series. Our host this afternoon is Jeannie Brinkema, who's a fellow here this year at the Newhouse Center. Jeannie is an assistant professor of contemporary literature and media at MIT, and the project she's working on, she's interested in issues of form and affect in horror films, and you can get her going on that. You'll get an earful. Anyone who has spent 2 minutes with Jeannie will recognize her quick wit and her generous intelligence and boundless enthusiasm. We're in for a treat. I want to thank her very much for agreeing to do the hostess duties this afternoon and look forward to hearing her conversation. Quick reminder, Geoff Dyer will read for a little bit. The two of them will have a conversation in the front for a little bit, and then we'll open it up to questions, and then there's books for sale afterwards. So turn off your phone, other noise-making devices, and I'll hand things over to Jeannie. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Carol, and thanks to Geoff, who I've had the pleasure of spending already several hours with today, and we're still not done. We promised each other we wouldn't talk about anything we're going to talk about later, but his company is really quite lovely, and so I know you're going to enjoy it today. And again, thanks to Carol and Cams for involving me in this week. As Carol said, welcome to the Newhouse Center to culminate our week of work on Andrei Tarkovsky's 1979 film Stalker, a work that tends to be either unseen and reportedly slow-moving to the point of agonizing boredom in sort of the bad object film, or viewed obsessively by cinephiles and fetishistically adored. There's little middle ground with this film. Today, as part of our Distinguished Writer Series, as Carol said, Geoff Dyer will be reading from his 2012 book, Zona, which takes as its subtitle, a book about a film about a journey to a room. And by way of introducing Geoff Dyer in general, let's linger with the hinges of that subtitle for just a minute, for those two abouts seem absolutely crucial to the curious body of work that he's produced today. What should I tell you about Geoff Dyer? Should I tell you about him as a historical figure, that he is British, that he was an only child, that he lives in London, that he's currently teaching in Iowa? You can learn all of this and much, much more simply by reading his books, which are threaded through, often to the point of being stitched together, with asides about his childhood, very intimate bodily confessions, distracted work habits, and even what takes place in his imagination. So as goes a note at the beginning of his 2003 collection of ostensible travel writings, Yoga for People Who Can't Be Bothered to Do It, quote, everything in this book really happened, but some of the things that happened only happened in my head. By the same token, all the things that didn't happen there too. Or should I tell you about his output, offer up some kind of list? This becomes a bit unwieldy. Do you want to hear about his 4 novels, Paris Trance, The Search, The Color of Memory, or most recently the 2010 Jeff in Venice, Death in Varanasi? Or, for the sake of brevity, should I stick with telling you about his works of criticism? Out of Sheer Rage, Wrestling with D.H. Lawrence, his tessellated study of photography, The Ongoing Moment, or perhaps his best-known work, but beautiful, which, again, using that crucial word, is, quote, a book about jazz. But then, there are all the essays, the reviews, the minor, as he puts it in one collection, bits and bobs that we really should also talk about too. These are for The Guardian or for the New York Times Book Review, collected from time to time in fat volumes, including Working the Room, and most recently otherwise known as The Human Condition. But those collections cannot contain all of those pieces, and so they spill out, and so I'm not really talking about them either. Nor have I spoken about his book on the First World War, The Missing of the Somme, or his early study of John Berger, Ways of Telling, and I haven't mentioned the work as an editor, I haven't mentioned the forewords to books of photography, or any of the numerous awards. One might talk about any of these things when introducing Geoff Dyer, but it is extremely difficult to talk about all of them. These so many abouts, despite their very targets, are really about something formal, which is the problem of genre. A complication that trips up any attempt to talk about Dyer's body of work as though those neat taxonomies were strict divisions. For one is as apt to recognize writer Geoff with a G in fictional Geoff with a J in Venice, as to find in the midst of a rumination on D.H. Lawrence, a long aside on Dyer's vanishing desire to write a novel, a fading that ends up constituting a new writing, one that is about that very waning. So any introduction that would hold to strict accounts of these are the novels and these are the essays and this is the criticism as separate entities is ultimately going to fail to hold. And perhaps his work is above all about that beautiful general muddying. And this is why even when he is not writing essays proper, Dyer always strikes me as writing essays in the sense of forms that constitute trials or attempts. He seems to be always testing genre in a way. And certainly he does that in the book that he'll read from today. There's just a little bit more to say about those abouts. About, of course, suggests on the subject of, or concerning, or in regard to. And Zona is certainly about Tarkovsky's film in a literal sense, constituting a summary of what takes place in the film. But running alongside, interrupting, even overtaking, or patiently waiting are also digressions in a series of starred notes, ones that are about writing about Tarkovsky, and also about many other things. About also indicates a movement or a problem of direction, as in I am trying to find my way about. And for a book that is about film, that is about a journey, which itself takes the form of a kind of writerly journey, this sense of approach and perpetually finding one's way about seems apt here as well. Finally, though, I'm an etymology geek. The word about derives from a very old word that means on the outside of, but in the neighborhood of. And this is the sense in which all of Geoff Dyer's disparate works are really about something, taking on this quality of being outside but in the neighborhood, outside of the academy but writing quasi-scholarly criticism, outside of communities but traveling within them as a temporary resident of their curiosities. And his work is thus about jazz, photography, literature, film, sex, aging, family, thrift, travel, tedium, and even donuts. And just when his work seems to be about something fundamentally trivial, even banal, say the search for a favorite pastry across various cities, it also stands outside, in the neighborhood of, in that case, a meditation on how one spends one's time, what habits and roots and small gestures of the everyday end up constituting how one has spent one's time, which is to say, what one's entire life is ultimately about. Which brings us to today. How does Geoff Dyer spend his time? One of Dyer's most cited influences, and we had the pleasure of talking about this at lunch today, is the French literary theorist and philosopher Roland Barthes. And he in fact supplies a foreword to Barthes' beautiful meditation on both photography and his mother's death, Camera Lucida. In an essay about a Russian film not made by Tarkovsky, but I wondered if Geoff had this in mind when he was writing Zona, Barthes makes some notes on Sergei Eisenstein's Ivan the Terrible. In this essay, The Third Meaning, Barthes notes that there are several levels of meaning that we might figure out in an image from a film. We might grapple with the informational level. In other words, everything in essence one can learn from what we see in the image. Or we might grapple with the symbolic level. We might ask, what do those themes mean? Things that students in film classes do all the time. Having done that, is the critic's task over, Barthes wonders? And his definitive answer is no, for I am still held by the image. One can see and glean and interpret and understand, but there's still what he calls a third meaning that is evident, erratic, obstinate, and what he ultimately, and very idiosyncratically, links to the thickness of the makeup on the courtiers' faces in that film. We learn in Zona that Dyer has been living with, watching and rewatching, considering and tarrying with Tarkovsky's Stalker for over 3 decades. And even after all that spending of all that time, he still appears to be held by the image. In so many ways, in so many genre-obliterating forms, and with so many works, Geoff Dyer seems to me to always be grappling with this fundamental fact that he is still held by the recording, by the photograph, by the strange meandering film he has seen so many times. And the only way to hold on to the brute certain fact of still being held seems to be to keep writing about, to linger outside, but in the neighborhood of that holding in relation to all these many things. On that note, please join me in welcoming him to the Newhouse Center.
This is going to be one of those rare occasions when the reading itself is a bit of a letdown after the introduction. So thank you, Carol, for this invitation, and thank you all for coming. Kind of reminded there with all that about stuff of, Bob Dylan, when he was asked what his songs were about, came up with the great reply, well, some are about 5 minutes, some are about 8 minutes, some are even about 13 minutes. I gather that you all had the experience of seeing Stalker from a 35mm print yesterday. I mean, you lucky people. Because I say lucky because I was doing an event in New York in the spring, and I was reliably informed by that not always entirely reliable narrator, Lawrence Weschler, that there was not a single print in the whole of the North American continent. So obviously his investigations didn't bring him to here.
To London.
That's you got the print from London. Wow, so that's great, and I think this is one of the things that Jeannie and I will talk about. Just preface, I'm sure you've had some egotistical writers here in your time, but I'll begin this by quoting myself, which is always a nicely vulgar thing to do. When I handed in the manuscript of this book, I said to my agent, I think you'll agree it's my greatest achievement. But I think we should backtrack a little bit so that we can provide some context for that comment. I was, when that book, Geoff in Venice, was published in Britain, I moved to a new publisher, and because, like a sort of footballer getting towards the end of his career, they wanted to make sure I was good for more than one season. They sort of said, well, what might you write next? And because I've always loved tennis, and because I played tennis with my publisher, and because at that point Andy Murray was poised to win a Grand Slam, I said, I'd like to write a book about tennis. And it was one of those great publishing kissy, huggy moments. So I was going to write a book about tennis, we're all going to get rich, and it was all fantastic. Anyway, so that all sort of started happening, and then I found that although I was really still very interested in tennis, I just didn't want to write it, and I should have known better. I know that I hate to have contracts out. I'm not one of these writers who needs that sort of that signed commitment, that obligation to do things. In fact, I found that not only was I, as always, having trouble getting going on a book, but the fact that I knew I had to deliver it, it was laying on me like a tombstone, and I couldn't make any progress at all. And I know as a writer well enough, I've been doing it for long enough, that I know the worst thing you can do is to sort of try to ride a bike with the brakes on, whereby you exhaust yourself and you fall off. And then it happened that Stalker was being shown in London, and there was a panel discussion afterwards, and I remember thinking, why didn't they invite me to take part in this panel discussion? And then I realised, well, I'll just write something about Stalker. And I started, just for fun really, I just started doing this crazy thing. I started summarising the film, and as a way mainly of bunking off from writing the tennis book. And in no time at all, I went from being depressed about not writing a tennis book to having a really fun time summarising this film, which had meant so much to me. So, what I'm going to do is read you a bit of my summary of the book. And what happens is that at the beginning I stick very closely to what's being shown on screen. So in some weird way the book is like a kind of, almost like a novelization of what's going on. And then, as you know, those of you who saw the film yesterday, gradually what starts off as a straightforward trip or journey becomes progressively more meandering, and they fall prey to more and more sort of philosophical disquisitions. And the same thing happens with my book. As the book proceeds, so there are more and more of these little digressions from me about matters raised by the film. So I'll read a little bit from the beginning, and then we'll read some bits from the end where I talk about, I give my views on some of the things that Tarkovsky mentions. By the way, were you all at the film yesterday? Oh, okay. So, has everyone seen Stalker? Okay, do I need to worry about spoilers? No, okay, well that's a good attitude, as though no, because I've got no intention of ever seeing it. It sounds so boring. I should say, I've come increasingly to dislike those books where people say in a sort of introduction exactly what they're going to do. I like those books such as you get by Roberto Calasso, where you're just plunged straight into this kind of thing. So there's no introduction at all here. I'm going to start with the very first words of the book once we've had the epigraphs. An empty bar, possibly not even open, with a single table no bigger than a small round table, but higher, the sort you lean against while you stand and drink. If floorboards could speak, these look like they could tell a tale or two, though the tales would turn out to be one and the same, ending with the same old lament, not just in terms of what happens here, but in bars the world over. After a few drinks, people think they could walk all over me. We are, in other words, already in a realm of universal truth. The barman comes in from the back, lights a cigarette, and turns on the lights. 2 fluorescent tubes, one of which doesn't work properly. It flickers. He looks at the flickering light. You can see him thinking, that needs fixing, which is not the same thing at all as, I'll fix that today, but which is very nearly the same as, it'll never be fixed. Daily life is full of these small, repeated astonishments, hopes that it might somehow have fixed itself overnight, and resignations it hasn't and won't. A tall man, a customer, enters the bar, puts his knapsack under the table. He's tall but not young, balding, obviously not a terrorist, and there's no way that his knapsack could contain a bomb, but this unremarkable action, putting a knapsack under the table in a bar, is not one that can now go unremarked, especially by someone who first saw Stalker on Sunday, February the 8th, 1981, shortly after seeing the Battle of Algiers. He orders something from the barman, whose white jacket also serves as a towel, possibly as a dishcloth, and maybe as a hanky too. The whole place looks like it could be dirty, but it's too dingy to tell, and the credits in yellow sci-fi Cyrillic do not exactly clarify the situation. It's the kind of bar men meet in prior to a bank job that is destined to go horribly wrong, and the barman is the type to take no notice of anything that's not his business, and the more things that are not his business, the better it is for him, even if it means that business is so slow as to be almost non-existent. As far as he's concerned, as long as he's here minding his own business and wearing his grubby barman's jacket, he's doing his job. And if no one comes, and no one wants anything, and nothing needs doing, the wonky light can wait, as can most things. It's all the same to him. Still smoking, he trudges over with a coffee pot. He's one of those barmen who makes the simplest task feel like the labour of a minimum wage Hercules. He pours some coffee for the stranger, goes out back again, and leaves him to it, to his coffee, to his sipping and waiting. Of that, there can be no doubt. The stranger is definitely waiting for something or someone. A caption, some kind of meteorite or alien visitation, has led to the creation of a miracle, the Zone. Troops were sent in and never returned. It was surrounded by barbed wire and a police cordon. This caption was added at the behest of the studio, Mosfilm, who wanted to stress the fantastical nature of the zone where the subsequent action will be set. They also wanted to make sure that the bourgeois country where all this happened could not be identified with the USSR. Hence, this mysterious business of the zone all happened, according to the caption, quote, in our small country, which put everyone off the scent because the USSR, as we all know, covered a very large area, and Russia was, still is, huge too. Russia. I can still hear Laurence Olivier saying it now in the Barbarossa episode of The World at War. The boundless motherland of Russia. Faced with the German invasion of 1941, Russians fell back on the traditional strategy, the strategy that had done for Napoleon and would do for Hitler too. Trade space for time, said Olivier, a message Tarkovsky took to heart. The sound of water dripping. We peer through an interior set of doors into a room. In film script shorthand, int means interior and ext, exterior. This is a kind of super int or int. Inside already, the camera inches deeper inside. It's as if Tarkovsky has started where Antonioni left off in the famous inside-out shot at the end of The Passenger and taken it a stage further. Inside, in. As slow as that, but without the colour. Antonioni's earlier Red Desert would, as the title suggests, be unimaginable without the colour. The colour, Monica Vitti's green coat, is what makes it wonderful. But for the 34-year-old Tarkovsky, interviewed in 1966, the year he completed his second feature, Andrei Rublev, it was, quoting, the worst of his films after The Cry. It was the worst of his films because of the colour, because Antonioni got so seduced, he said, by Monica Vitti's red hair against the mists, because the colour, said Tarkovsky, has killed the feeling of truth. Well, this takes a bit of chewing and digesting. Take away the colour, and what are you left with? You're left with L'Avventura, I suppose, also with Monica Vitti, and you're so bored you long for colour, for something to make time pass or to stop you minding that it's not passing. Since we're speaking about truth and how it feels, I feel honour bound to admit that L'Avventura is the nearest I have ever come to pure cinematic agony. I saw it one summer in a tiny cinema in the 5th arrondissement of Paris, where the screen was no bigger than a big telly. A black and white film, in Italian, with French subtitles, in Paris, in August, in my late 20s. A case study in loneliness. The only way I was able to get through it was by saying to myself, I can't bear this for another second, even though there was not actually such a thing as a second in L'Avventura. A minute was the minimum increment of temporal measurement. Every second lasted a minute, every minute lasted an hour, and an hour a year, and so on. Trade time for a bigger unit of time. Do I need to be concerned about that? Okay. When I finally emerged into the Parisian twilight, I was in my early 30s. Even to describe the black and white of Stalker as black and white is to tint what we're seeing with an inappropriate suggestion of the rainbow. Technically, this concentrated sepia was achieved by filming in colour and printing in black and white. The result is a kind of sub-monochrome in which the spectrum has been so compressed that it might turn out to be a source of energy, like oil and almost as dark, but with a gold sheen too. As well as the dripping, there is a certain amount of creaking and other spooky noises that are not easy to explain. We are in the room now, looking at a bed. Okay, I think that gives you a sense. That's a that's how it starts really, with that close summary of what's happening on screen. I'll now read just a little bit from that great moment. You'll remember, those of you who seen the film, that incredible sequence when they're heading into the zone. There's that long tracking sequence where we've got the heads of the three characters who are going into the zone. And it lasts for ages. And then we get, I mean, I don't want to spoil the incredible suspense of my own book, but you'll see what happens. So just bear in mind that the point at which we join the book and the film now, this sequence, the trolley car sequence, has been going on for quite a long while. It lasts long enough, this sequence, to lull us into a kind of trance. There then occurs one of the miracles of cinema, one of several miracles in a film about an allegedly miraculous place. It's not a jump cut or fade, but suddenly and gently, the clanging and echoey clank of the music and trolley are still on the soundtrack. Unambiguously, we're in colour and in the zone. You can watch the trolley car sequence again and again, can refuse to succumb to its hypnotic monotony, and you can never predict where it will come, this moment of subtle and absolute transition. Camera and trolley continue clanking forward for a few moments and then come to a halt. The camera pauses and moves back. We are there. We are in the zone. It's every bit as lovely as Stalker had claimed, and at the same time, quite ordinary. The air is full of the sound of birds, of wind in the trees, running water, mist, muted greens, weeds and plants swaying in the breeze, the tangled wires of a tilted telegraph pole, the rust and remains of a car. We are in another world that is no more than this world, perceived with unprecedented attentiveness. Landscapes like this have been seen before Tarkovsky, but I don't know how else to put it. Their beingness had not been seen in this way. Tarkovsky reconfigured the world, brought this landscape, this way of seeing the world, into existence. Many forms of landscape depend on a particular artist or writer or artistic movement to render them beautiful, to make us see, make the rest of us see what has always been there. But it's not only the unchanging, eternal, natural world that needs to be mediated in this way. Walker Evans opened our eyes to the sagging shacks, wrecked cars, and fading signs of America in the 30s. To that extent, Evans anticipated Robert Bresson's reminder to himself in Notes on the Cinematographer. Make visible what without you might perhaps never have been seen. A little later, Bresson added a medium-specific twist to this ambition. Quality of a new world, which none of the existing arts allowed to be imagined. Two related questions then. Would we regard this landscape of fields, abandoned cars, tilted telegraph poles, and trees as beautiful without Tarkovsky? And could it have been brought into existence by any medium other than film? If Stalker had not been the first Tarkovsky film I saw, then I might have recognized elements of this landscape from Mirror, the cross T's at the telegraph poles, the greens made more lush somehow by being subdued, the distinction between the man-made and the natural being eroded before our eyes. If I had seen Mirror, I might have recognized this landscape, these elements, as Tarkovsky land. I might have echoed the first words uttered by Stalker. Here we are, home at last. And yet at some level, I must have recognized, or at least been familiar with, a modest and local variant of this kind of landscape, which perhaps accounts, in part, for why the film has made such a deep impression on me. There's just one train station now in Cheltenham, where I grew up, but in the late 1950s and early 1960s, there were four. One of these, the Hampton, was only a 5-minute walk from where we lived. My father used to take me up there when I was a toddler to watch trains steam in and out. The line and the station closed down in 1962 when I was 4. I've no recollection of going there with my dad, only of his telling me that we used to go there. But I have strong memories of heading off to this abandoned, brambly zone to play with a couple of friends when we were 8 or 9. The windows of the disused station building had been smashed and the rain had seeped in. It looked as if it had long ago fallen into decay. Faded, rain-buckled, the timetable was still displayed, a memorial to its own passing. An empty packet of Players' cigarettes, the ones my mother smoked, with the face of the bearded sailor on the front, gone to a watery grave at the bottom of a puddle, frog-spawny, rust-coloured, pond-size, cloudy with gnats. The tracks had rusted, were overgrown with weeds, grass, stinging nettles, dandelions. Sometimes we followed them for a while, beyond the ends of the platforms, but never as far as the next station along, also abandoned, a couple of miles away, in Charlton Kings. Here we are, says Stalker, home at last. Then I'm just going to read you a little bit, one of these little sort of versions, one of these little digressions towards the end, where I start dealing with the sort of stuff that, some of this issues that Tarkovsky raises. So, at the heart of the zone is a place where it's claimed your innermost wish comes true. It's important to stress that it's only your innermost wish. It's not what you think you want, which might be lots of money or whatever. It's what your innermost wish is. And so, and this happens in the film, actually when you get to this place, of course we all think we want our innermost wish to be revealed, but actually the closer people get to it, the more reluctant they are to enter this room because, you know, can they bear to be confronted with what they really are? So, this is where I start, and there's loads of discussion as the film proceeds about, you know, what it means to encounter your, to have the chance of realizing your deepest wish. And this is a bit where I kind of extrapolate from this. Well, what about this scenario then? What if you got here and went into the room, believing in it absolutely, and it turned out that you didn't have an innermost wish? That all the things you thought you wished for, you didn't actually want. You leave the room, leave the zone, and nothing happens. Jack shit. Would you conclude from this that you were absolutely content, purring on a daily basis like a cat or a dog whose bowl of milk was constantly replenished? Unlikely. Or at least if you had been content without realizing it, now you would most certainly be filled with discontent. You would conclude that the room did not work, that you'd been sold a pup, that Stalker had not undergone the changes that he went through as Tarkovsky reworked, rewrote, and reshot the film. You would phone him, demand a refund, threaten to blacken his name, turn him into the authorities, or at the very least, refuse to recommend him to friends, considering a once-in-a-lifetime trip to the much-vaunted zone. Of course, Stalker would have none of it. In the extremely unlikely event that he returned, or even answered your calls, he would insist that it had worked, that it was working perfectly, and so you would be left seething, dissatisfied, cheated, unable to accept that this was your innermost wish, your innermost nature. It's what we call in the trade a parable. So, Jeannie, now it's dialogue time. Great, thank you. Oh, okay, right. Okay, sure thing. Yeah. This is the problem. It's so often difficult to tell the difference between a standing ovation and people heading to the exit. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, it seems that it would be appropriate to begin at the beginning. If you don't already have this, you may well within the hour. But my question for you is, this is a book that is a summary of what happens in the film, but this is a film that is also about green, it's about the position of the camera, and yet there are no images inside the book, which again, some of you know, there is one image on the cover. So I was curious if you could speak about why there are no stills from the film inside, and also how you decided that the sole image that would represent the film is the child reading from the very end of it.
Oh, what a great question. It's always nice to have the opportunity to sort of express your pissed offness in public, isn't it? So we have to go back a little while. Suddenly I've got all loud. Anyway, I know the sound guy is great. He will adjust me. So, I mean, as you know, I wrote this history of photography, and I had no experience of doing this before, so and it was essential to me that I had lots of images. And then when it came to it, I realized that that the work of getting hold of getting images is unbelievably boring. And from my miserly point of view, even worse, it's unbelievably expensive. It's just terrible. And after that, I mean, I really thought I would never do a book again that required images. And this was a book of, some of the reviews of the book have complained about, A, the lack of images. And so that, I say, don't mention it to me. Get on the phone to Robert Frank, Dune Arbus, and Roy de Carava's people. It's not my fault. And then they complain, so they complain about the absent images, then they complain about the way the images are so small. Well, blame the centre, blame all these people who wanted to charge this unbelievable amount of money to reproduce them. Anyway, that's my grievance. That's a book where I really, in an ideal world, the images would have been bigger, they'd have been on glossy paper, all this kind of stuff. Because there was lots of kind of really close reading of photographs. Now with this book, it wasn't, I didn't even want photographs, even if I'd been offered them for free. Because really, I wanted the book to float free of the film. To the extent that, you know, going back to that anecdote I told about at the beginning, whereby, you know, it wasn't going to be a book about tennis, which had considerable commercial appeal. Instead, it was going to be, this book with very limited commercial appeal. In fact, I'll now complete the end of that anecdote, whereby, you know, I said to my agent when I handed it in, I think you'll agree that since the publishers commissioned a book on tennis, I think you'll agree that in terms of my disregard for the market, or what a publisher might reasonably expect, this is my greatest achievement. I wanted it to float free of the film, partly because it's not always entirely reliable, but also I felt the one thing that this deeply uncommercial book had going for it was that you didn't have to have seen the film in order to enjoy the book. So anything that allowed it to have this kind of autonomous, independent life was a good thing, whereas pictures would have anchored it and grounded it much more and condemned it to being a sort of secondary text. Whereas now, I think really, the film is no more than a trailer for my own book.
Well, let's talk about that some more. You use the word summary all the time, right? This is a summary of a book. Now the book is also autonomous of the film. Is it an act of criticism, though? Some of your harshest words in some of your earliest work is dedicated to skewering academic criticism that takes apart the object of its study. Is this a work of film criticism?
Yes, among other things. Just to be, this is the great thing, isn't it, Mick? You see, I am the world's leading expert on my own work. And so I think it wasn't just that I wasn't talking so much about literary criticism, which it seems to me that's silly. It was a particular era and kind of theory to which I became incredibly hostile. But yeah, criticism is always going to be there, isn't it? You know, you come out of a film or you read a book and you say to your friend, you know, at the most basic level, you say, that was great, or that was crap. And then typically you then, you know, perhaps justify it, you articulate why that is so. Yeah, I really think it's a work of criticism, especially if we bear in mind, you know, that opening line of George Steiner's book, Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, that crucial first line of his when he says, you know, I wish I could do, I'll try to do the George Steiner voice. You know, all criticism should arise from a debt of love. And, you know, this is very much a kind of a love letter, really. And in the way of the best love letters, it's that kind of thing of saying, in a way, you know what, it's still mysterious to me, what is so fantastic and wondrous about you, about the film. So yeah, it's a lot of other things as well, but I really think it's a book of criticism, also in terms of the process. People often ask me about what I think criticism is, and for me it's an incredibly simple thing. You try to describe as accurately as possible the thing that you're talking about. And the best art critics, for example, are those who bring a painting alive verbally on the page. You then articulate your feelings about it. And ideally then, by doing that very, very precisely, that contains a kind of judgment, I think. It's not like the judgment is tacked on at the end where, where you give it either 2 thumbs up or what's the other symbol, a miserable face. I guess at the back of my, it's this book which is about a film I saw 30 years ago. I'm going to put this clock down, it's really bugging me. It also, it draws on all sorts of other stuff that's been around for a long time. So, it's so present in my mind, those lines. There's John Berger, who's been so important to me. He quotes Walter Benjamin, who quotes Goethe. This is logged in my mind for so long, when Goethe says, there is a delicate form of the empirical which identifies itself so closely with the object under discussion that it thereby becomes theory. Hence the need for the very detailed summary, because there it is, that very detailed sort of identification of the, it's a very empirical study in a way, highly subjective.
It's interesting because, of course, the film is also based on a book. So in some ways it's Janus-faced. You have a book about a film, it's a film that's about a book, and then the image that you choose for the cover, there is an image, of course, to not allow it to float entirely, is Monkey reading, almost as though she's reading the source that the film itself is drawing from. It's curious to me, do you see the book also staging a confrontation then between writing and cinema? You are all in favor of medium specificity and really praise the beauties of seeing the film on 35mm, that it's important to see the film in its filminess. But clearly writing is doing something here. Are they in tension? Are they supporting each other?
Yeah, I completely forgot that second part of your first question about why we have that lovely image on. And I like the way that she's reading the, reading the book. And I guess I should also say that sequence, for me, that is, it is so unbelievably beautiful, that the sequence that begins with that image. And I did a reading at Stanford, and they did a really nice thing for the poster advertising the event. They're so, in this way that young people can do these things, they slightly digitally manipulated it so she was actually reading my book. The word autotelic is sort of lurking somewhere in the, so that it seemed to me, the book is a reading of the film. And I guess, it's one of the things I've been kind of keen on in a way. On the one hand, I want the book to float free of the film. On the other hand, I would say that a long-running thing in the books I've done, I don't know if some of you have been to London, travelled on the Underground, when you pull into stops, this message comes over, mind the gap, referring to the gap between the train and the platform. They don't want you to fall in it. And when I was a student, I was so conscious of the gap between the texts we were reading, Dickens, George Eliot, whatever, which was great fun, loved it, and then the criticism, which was so boring, the huge gap. And it seemed to me that was a gap that was an abyss into which many undergraduates fall, never to re-emerge. There it is, it's the gap. And so in a weird way, I feel that my writing after that has been sort of trying to shrink the gap, so that But Beautiful is very like, it's imbued with some of the things about jazz, and in some ways this book unfolds sort of filmically in a way that a photography book unfolds, sort of photographically. So I like that ekphrastic kind of quality to things as well. Each medium has certain things going for it. I've never had any desire to write film scripts, but one of the things about writing a film script is, you want to show a sunset. You want there to be a sunset, you just write sunset. Then it's up to the filmmaker to bring the sunset to life. But since as a writer, one of the things I like doing is I like describing sunsets. I've got no desire to write a film script. So there are certain incompatibilities between media. So, with the jazz book, the basic incompatibility is that thing in jazz, because it's improvisational, there's that onus put on freshness, spontaneity, or the illusion of spontaneity, and the idea is that if you rehearse it too much, it'll go dead. Typically with writing, it gets better and better the more you work on it, you know, and I guess Kerouac is the kind of test case of this, you know, and I like the way that, you know, it's been revealed that he kept, you know, in spite of the myth, you know, it turns out he kept revising on the road to make it more spontaneous. You know, anyway, so there's, you know, there's points at which the book and the, I mean, this is a film that lends itself very well, very easily to being written about, because it's a very wordy film for one thing, and also because it's actually, although it's slow, I'm struck by now, whenever I watch it, by how sort of exciting it is. It's a journey, and once you've got a journey, of course, then you've got narrative, and, you know, where are they going to go next? So since as a writer I'm unable to think of plots, well then I just hitched my cart to Tarkovsky's pony and went along for the ride. He provided the plot stuff for me.
Well, let's talk about that in the form of the book. And this is so hard to get from a reading, but you can see it, of course, very clearly on the page. There's a main body of the text, and then there are a series of starred notes. And the starred notes might appear maybe one per page. There might be two per page. We might have several pages without them. And then there might be a very long, pages-long digression. Do you see a hierarchical relationship between the two? Would you like people to read the book as two separate texts? Is it like a jazz standard and improvisation? What's the relation between the upper and the lower body of the page?
Yeah, well, do you know, one of my undergraduate, one of the books that I most loved as an undergraduate was that Penguin edition we had of of Wordsworth, the Prelude, the parallel text, where you get, what is it, I can't remember the years now, whichever version and the other version, and they'd run on two parallel pages, one on the verso, one on the recto, and it was great, I loved that. And I knew that there was going to be several things going on in the book. One, this summary of the book, which is unfolding, and then this other stuff about both the making of the film and my own sort of personal, you know, the way that my life had combined with. So at one stage I thought about maybe trying to do it as a parallel text, but that wouldn't have worked at all because there would be so many sections where it was all summaries. You'd get, you know, verso page blank, recto page crammed full, or the other way around. So that wouldn't have worked. So the way I did it with footnotes, that was the least irritating way of doing it, although I accept totally that it is still somewhat irritating. One of the reasons that the footnotes are in the same font, the same size as the main body of the text, is precisely because there's nothing subordinate about it, that they're of equal importance. It's frustrating with some of the long footnotes that you sort of lose track of where you are. But to go back again to that mind the gap point, you know, bear in mind that the book, you know, the film, there are more and more of these long digressions about things among the characters, whereby the ongoing journey to the room gets, you know, they sort of don't get anywhere, or they go off on some sort of detour, and then you realize they're back where they started. And also, crucially, if we remember that there's one great bit in the film when Ryder says in his, you know, grumpy way, he says, you know, what are we doing all this stuff, throwing those nuts and stuff? We could walk there, it's only 100 yards. And Stalker says, yeah, but you can't go there directly, we've got to go all around the houses. So weirdly, all of these digressions, for which I have a fondness anyway, they were apt, by doing that, I stuck very, very carefully to the root of the film. It was, you know, it was a real, yeah, it remained, it didn't stray at all. Or rather, in order to be faithful to the book, to the film, I had to stray like that.
Can you read the book in real time alongside? Is it like Dark Side of the Moon and Wizard of Oz? Can you sync the two up perfectly?
Do you know, for a brief while, I thought, I loved that idea, and I worked out, I'm a very slow reader, and I worked out that, yeah, you could just about read the book in real time. And then the book got longer, and I realised, oh my God, then you could still do it, you'd have to start reading quicker and quicker and quicker. And that was absolutely incompatible with this book, that it proceeds at this rather, at sort of walking pace. And the gain, and since you can't direct how quickly people read, it seemed that the gain in that was going to be small. So you can read it in real time if you're a really quick reader, but then we come back to that old Woody Allen joke about how he speed read War and Peace once. It's about Russia, we said.
Let's stay with time for a minute. You talk quite a bit about our expectations of time needing to get checked at the cinema door. You speak of Tarkovsky time, and then of course you speak of moron time as the opposite of that. So I was hoping you could elaborate on that. I was hoping you weren't going to read that passage. But also I'm curious if you see your own work as marked by a kind of Tarkovsky time. It's certainly anything but boring, it would seem to me. So I'm curious what you have to say about that.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, I'm certainly falling prey to moron time myself. Everything is sped up so much. And when I saw this film, I graduated, I'm in my early 20s, and I think my whole educational experience had been, at that age, was to persuade me that great things, great literature, it tended to have to be carrying quite a heavy freight of boredom about it. So that, you'd sort of feel, I'm reading The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. It's cosmically boring, therefore it's cosmically great. Anyway, now things have sped up a great deal now, and I wonder if the young audience, somebody of the age now that I was seeing Stalker then, I wonder how it would seem to them, because I was really steeped in slow-moving cinema by that time, and I think there would be two ways. It would either seem just so unbelievably slow as to be just unthinkable, or actually I think weirdly its specialness, its magic would be even more apparent. The crucial thing though, I think, well, I wasn't being entirely honest in that bit I read where I said that the Antonioni film was, that I found that boring, because for me the most boring films are these kind of fast-moving action blockbusters. They really bore the crap out of me. I can't. They're so boring. And one of the things with Tarkovsky, when I first went to see it, it was a slight, because it was billed as a science fiction film. I brought to it a slight impatience. So I think the thing is, it's not like there's some absolute pace at which something is either exciting or boring. It's more that the boredom that you feel is a kind of friction between your expectations and how it unfolds, which is why it was such genius on Tarkovsky's part when the guy from Mosfilm, or whatever it was, said to him after the preview, "Oh, Andrei, it's a great film, but could you just get it moving a bit more at the beginning?" And Tarkovsky exploded, "No, actually I'm going to make it even slower at the beginning so morons can go to see the Bourne Ultimatum or whatever without disturbing before it gets going." And that was really important because since finishing the book, I learned from Tom Luddy, who was involved in some way with Coppola's making of The Conversation, I think. Apparently they also thought that maybe The Conversation should start moving more quickly at the beginning. And actually all that did was get people into a kind of slightly more expectant groove, so that actually then they became impatient later on. So it was a really good idea to slow things down at the beginning, to get people into that kind of trance-like state. And now when I watch Stalker, I find that once he's left the wife and kid at home, it really I'd say it's like the sort of Keystone Cops. It's a car chase. It really does move along at quite a clip. So it's a question always, I feel, of just giving yourself to the experience, just trancing out to it, and then it stops being boring at all. And Tarkovsky had many comments like this, rather like John Cage, saying, you increase the length of a shot, and it's long shots. First of all, they're boring. Make it still longer, and people think, oh, this is interesting. Make it last still longer, and you get into this weird trance-like state where time ceases to exist.
A slightly different take on time, and that's, you say at one point that the reluctance or the hesitation to go into a room and the characters end up, as you say, on the threshold, is a specifically middle-aged problem. And there are asides, I started to trace them, there are asides about your wife's appearance over a long duration. There are asides about your father's regret at thrift early in his life, in my favorite tattoos. There are references to being middle-aged, And you talk also about the loss of wonder, that the best films in one's life come into one's life before one is 30. So my question for you is, could you have written this book about a film that you loved 20 years ago, when you had only loved it for 10 years? Is there something about aging and time that starts to order it?
Oh, what a great question. Yeah, I guess because, I mean, my sense of the film's greatness has only deepened over time. So I quote in the book, and one of the, I came across this passage when I was thinking of, it was one of the things that made me write the book. It's this line in Coetzee's Diary of a Bad Year, where he says, there are passages in the Brothers Karamazov, he says, which he's read innumerable times before, but rather than becoming inured to their power, he says he still finds himself sobbing helplessly. And I found that for me, I just found Stalker, I find it more and more moving. I found it more and more moving as I got older. And weirdly, this is quite, it's so inexhaustible. Even writing this book has done nothing. It's actually just made me more vulnerable to its greatness. So now, I mean, it's, I promise you, if we were watching it now, there'd be several sequences of it where I just find I'm crying because I find it so profound, so moving. And I think my sense of why it's so profound has, developed as I got older. And also I'm aware now in that way of things of just, this kind of, I look back now, and because I'm teaching at Iowa, and a lot of the kids there are sort of 25 or something, and I can see now that some of them are unbearably intense. There's a guy that I recommended that he read Adorno's Minima Moralia. He's a great guy. He's from sort of San Diego, so he's inherently relaxed. But reading these, great dialectical, it's just screwed him up into this tighter and tighter dialectical knot. And I sort of and he listens to a load of music, and I sort of think, just that sort of age, it's really, really special. There's something particularly about films. I'm really confident at this point that there's something about that age when you're seeing films, and your idea of what is the greatest film is so going to form you, especially if it happens to be a film which has come out at that moment. And it's not just me. I mean, I'm sure many people here love David Thompson's biographical dictionary of film. Really one of the great works of literature of our time, let alone one of the great film books. But the key entry of that film, who knows David Thompson's biographical dictionary of film? Yeah. What is the key entry? What is the Rosetta Stone entry? Well, it's the one on Kieran Hickey. What the fuck is Kieran Hickey, you ask? Because it's all, it's about all. Kieran Hickey is just this friend of his. And so it's all done alphabetically, because it's a dictionary, so there's entries on Antonio Ni Godard, but this great entry on Kieran Hickey, where he talks about how they met in the queue to see some Fellini film or something in the 50s at the NFT in London. And he talks about all the films they saw, and then he talks about how Kieran Hickey had such an influence on him in the writing of this book. And then, well, I can't actually even talk about this without getting so moved by it, but the entry on Kieran Hickey, it's so unbelievably moving what David Thompson says about him at the end, and it's about that. It's about looking back at that, at that phase. And there's different versions of this. It's what Wordsworth is banging on about all the time in the Prelude, isn't it? So yeah.
My last question before we turn it over to the group here is...
Can I just interrupt for a second? That wasn't one of my more stupid remarks. I am aware that cinema hadn't been invented when Wordsworth was writing the Prelude.
Time has no place here, that's fine. My last question for you is, this is a film that, almost in a medieval morality play, has characters who are named by what they do. So there's the writer, and there's the professor, and there's the stalker, meaning the guide, the one who sort of leads you through. But there's also the wife, there's also Monkey, the child. And I wanted to ask which of these you imagine yourself as most in the book. The writer who's looking for inspiration, the professor who's analytically taking something apart but is also terrified by that curiosity, the stalker who's guiding, the wife who ends by avowing that she loves something that's unfathomable, or the child who is reading.
is that just about the smartest question you've ever heard? I mean, it is on my part. So yeah, it's great. Well, on the one hand, I mean, I sort of identify with the washed-up, cynical, dissolute writer who just wants to spend all his time drinking. Yeah, I really identify with him. The professor, I mean, they call him professor. I don't know, in the Russian they might actually call him scientist, because that's what he is. It's not like he's a professor of, you know, literature or something. But I like the way he's called professor, because I feel in some way I'm between the two. I'm not a straight down the line writer in the sense that, you know, a novelist or whatever. So I'm between the two, doing this kind of creative criticism or whatever. What happens for me in the course of the many viewings of the film, I identify now so much with Stalker, and what becomes so moving the more you see the film is his absolute faith in this place, the Zone. You know, the way he believes in it so completely, and his despair that, you know, these people don't care about this thing that he loves so much. And, you know, I'm sure you'll all be familiar with this. There's, you know, okay, I've written this book about Stalker. Everyone in this room could probably do something about some work of art that means so much to them. And I think maybe you'll have been familiar with this rather under-commented on part of the dating process, whereby you take your, you know, the person you've just fallen for to see this film that means so much to you, or this piece of music, and basically, if they don't love it, then they're not going to make it to the next, because, you know, you just couldn't love somebody who was so idiotic, emotionally stunted as not to, you know, so there's that quality too, so I like that, and that also, then, you know, the way that the wife is, you know, she puts up with all of this stuff, but then there's no doubt at all, in a way, the central character in the, you know, the most important character in the film ends up being, you know, the little girl, and I've never written a book where I've learned so much about the subject of the book after the book is finished. So I've only just realised that all of the bits with the girl after the first sleeping sequence, she's in colour. So you know, she obviously, and colour we associate with the Zone, but she is clearly, you know, she's a Zone child. You know, she's got those sort of magical abilities. So. I identify with all. Maybe most of all, I identify with the surly barman called, what's his name, Igor or something. So I'm a bit, so it's the whole package. And of course, in some weird way, of course, to make a not very interesting point, I am like the Stalker in that I'm guiding readers through this, you know, through this film, and, you know, then it comes back to this thing, you know, what is the Zone? Well, the Zone is very obviously, whatever else it might be, it's about the wonder of cinematic space. So that's what I'm, you know, trying to guide people through in a Stalker-like way.
You also do a beautiful job in the book talking about the way the camera suggests a disembodied, spectral, other presence. Yeah. And for what it's worth, that's what I always felt that you were most like, governing, standing near, but outside of the film as well. Please join me in thanking Geoff Dyer, and then we'll take your questions.
Going through it in my mind, that they ever look at the landscape. They kind of pick the flowers and so the Stalker Zona really looking and loving the landscape, just having, you know, and it's so beautiful to him. But isn't the movie also kind of putting the viewer into the place of Stalker, because they have to look at it, they have to love it, they have this so much time to appreciate all those little things coming out of the things. And that, I mean, at the end, because I was going to say, well, which, that you, in a way, being by yourself watching a movie lets you love the trance, lets you not have these conversations. But then when you were talking about the girl, I was thinking of that great shot at the end when he puts her on your shoulder. So this, we're also, she's in his viewpoint. Yeah. You know, they're looking exactly the same. And anyway, so that's, but is it true that the writer and the professor never really kind of interact, except when the professor throws pieces of the bomb to make that beautiful splitter?
That's so interesting, isn't it? Yeah, I think you're right. They go to this unbelievably beautiful place, and they, you know, yeah, they don't look around much. I mean, Ryder sort of looks around only in order to confirm his sort of disposition that it's kind of disappointing right from the word go. And I love the way that what Stalker says about Porcupine, his teacher. He says he opened my eyes, and that's what Tarkovsky is doing, isn't he? He's really opening our eyes like that. Two other things. I think of the many great moments in the film, I think that shot when Monkey is on her dad's shoulders, and we think first of all she can walk. When that is one of the greatest moments in cinema. You know, it's a miracle. You know, she can walk. But it's a kind of miracle that even Richard Dawkins would have to accept as a miracle, because it turns out she's sitting on her dad's shoulders. So I like that, a miracle for rationalists. And then, of course, in the final shot, we get the complete, you know, the miracle which defies all physical explanation. And, you know, I mean, enlarge slightly on your point, that the last chapter in the yoga book where I go talk about Burning Man, you know, that's called The Zone. And, you know, the only way I could articulate my experience of Burning Man was by reference to Tarkovsky's Zone, this place where, you know, your deepest wishes could come true. And of course, as people famously say about Burning Man, you know, the experience you have there is actually very much dependent on what you bring to it. It's not like you go to a sort of fun park and, you know, there it is, the experience, and you all have the same thing. No, there's 30,000 people go, or how many it is now, and each one takes something different from it. So it has that nice quality of the zone too. And of course, as I say in that Leptis Magna place, where I really, you know, that was, you know, where I'm kind of wanting to get into that particular zone that classical antiquity gives you, you know, being amid the ruins of classical antiquity. Yeah, this stuff is all very close to my heart. I'm surprised to discover that, as you were talking, I was processing it. I think you're right. They're not so visual. The passages where I'm there with my friends. I think the Leptis Magna passage probably is the most visual. Yeah, but because the experience is entirely visual, I guess, of being there. Yeah, thank you. You do the choosing. Yeah.
Sure, thanks, Stevie. Okay, so Wordsworth has come up more today than it has in a couple of weeks, and so I just wanted to point out something or to think about something with you, which is in your book about photography, which I quite like, for a moment. You start out a book on photography talking about Borges, Walt Whitman, Wordsworth. We don't actually get to any photographers taking page 12. So I'm just curious about, you know, what you think, does literature have a certain purchase on the visual? Are you feeling like perhaps like you describing what you do as a crisis earlier, and again, you're using this visual medium, but you're using words to describe it, and I turn to poets to help you do that. I was just wondering if you could comment on your thoughts.
Yeah, oh, I guess I would quote T.S. Eliot. You know, well, I've got to use words when I talk to you. Yeah, I mean, I think in the case of the photography book, I think there's some sort of synergy or congruence between the brevity of poetry and the momentariness of the photograph. And then it just happened that with that Wordsworth bit, that lovely, the pun, you know, I'm talking about a picture by Paul Strand, and Wordsworth says he's walking across the crowded Strand, you know, so there's that kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's one of these things, I guess, whereby, you know, I like sort of writing which has this sort of concentrated quality. Well, John Berger is a huge influence on me, and the thing with Berger is that intensity of his gaze. You know, he just looks at that art, at that painting, whatever it might be, with that unbelievable concentration and intensity. To articulate what he's seeing, though, he draws on all this stuff that has come from, he's had a sort of wide range of stuff, crucially not just from other, not in the way that some art historians would do, whereby it would be said, yeah, there's all the knowledge of art history, but from everything that's happened in his life. So I guess the thing about Wordsworth particularly, quite often when I'm asked who are the writers who influenced me, it'll all trip off my tongue. Oh, Roland Barthes, all this stuff. And what I sometimes forget to mention Wordsworth. Why? Because he's in my bloodstream. It absolutely, it's just so there in my being. So that's why that stuff was there. But yeah, I find it sort of, poetry just seemed to serve as such a useful captioning tool in the photography book. And then in the weird way of things as well in this book, I mean, it just seemed there was, I noticed there seemed to be a lot of bits of Rilke that seemed appropriate to Tarkovsky. And so I was delighted when, when I came across a letter where he says something like, I feel that, Russia is really close to me and I can really reawaken Russia, one of his mad sort of rushes to the head that he had.
First off, thank you so much for doing this. I guess we were talking a lot about time earlier in the conversation, and I was thinking, in But Beautiful, you seem to really get at the kind of power and joy, ecstasy, whatever, of frenzy, of like the solo in jazz, or of, I don't know, like Beingness just like exploding in the moment, like smashing his fist in the car, whatever it is, these like moments of like pure explosion of frenzy. And then I didn't know when you just said that you're teaching Iowa. Do you think that there's also a capacity in the United States because of the sort of expanse of the country? You're like dead in the middle of the nation now. To slow down time too, in the way that Russia slows down time because of how huge it is.
Yeah. Well, I'll just correct you. I'm not dead in the middle of. I'm alive. I wonder. Yeah, and I certainly like that. I think coming from this crowded, cloudy little rock in the middle of the Atlantic, as I do, where do I most like to be in the world? It's in the southwest of America, and just in the way, in the sort of footsteps of Lawrence. When he first gets to Taos, and it's like he can literally, in Lawrence's case, he can literally breathe more deeply. So I feel that just some, that sense of being hemmed in, partly by just the smallness of it, but more importantly by the kind of by just the clouds hanging over you, and just to be in that kind of where the landscape and the sky opens up. I've not spent any time in the Midwest before, and I've not actually had any prairie experience. So what you're talking about, I certainly associate with the deserts of the Southwest. And I guess I should say that here when my wife and I used to go to Burning Man, she would always say that I'd been sort of biologically sort of formed to thrive in the desert, because I've got this body like a sort of thorny bush, just like the kind of thing that can go without water in the Kalahari, and then So yeah, I feel very at home in spacious places. You've been overlooked so many times.
You recently wrote an introduction for a writing book.
Oh yeah.
And that you talk about the development of skill. You talk about tennis. You have a good forehand. You work on your backhand. But writing doesn't work that way. You mentioned how you've just never been good at plot.
Yeah.
And one of the things that what I love so much about your books is you find these pockets of waxing philosophical digressions. It's interesting that the professor back there mentioned when you go to Tripoli, because that passage where you talk about cold soup, I love that so much. And is that your way of progressing plot, of just...
Yeah. So just to go back to the tennis point for those of you. So what I was talking about is that, since tennis is all about, if anybody has a weakness at top class tennis, it will be exploited. So if you've got a weak backhand in tennis, you've got to make sure you don't have a weak backhand. Whereas with writing, it seems to me, you've got a weak backhand, okay, you don't need to use your backhand at all. You can just do it all on the forehand. And so for me, but plot-wise, yes, I've never been able to think of plot, but also as a reader, I've never gone to novels for plot. And actually, plots always rather bore me. I mean, all the plot I need is, Updike has enough plot for me, and there it just gives you enough traction, really. I think that's the key word. And always what I've liked is the idea of, I always like sort of little digressions, but digressions that are hopefully sort of integral. I love the idea of the integral digression. So with somebody like, one of the great digressors, Kapuscinski, let's say, it's amazing. Here's this guy who's doing some kind of thing that we might call reporting, telling facts about a place, although, asterisk, I know there's all sorts of debate about the extent to which Kapuscinski is reliable. But yeah, those digressions are a form of reporting. And I like that very, very much. I guess also I'm one of these people that, when I was 18 and about to go to university, I thought, yeah, I love the idea of philosophy. I like the idea of philosophy. That sounds like some wise stuff. And then, of course, philosophy turns out to be, academic philosophy turns out to be so not to be giving that, give you that, unless you're in that sort of Nietzsche, Choran, Kierkegaard kind of stuff. I love that. And it seems to me that what you get in Nietzsche particularly, I mean, there you've got all the kind of, all the psychological stuff of the novel, but just haven't got any of the, he comes into the room, all that kind of stuff. So I think I'm drawn to that increasingly as I get older and more impatient. I sort of so identify with that line of Lawrence's, when he says, when I was young I had very little patience, and now I'm old, I have none at all. Of course, when he says he's old, he's dead by the time he's 44 or whatever. But yeah, I like that kind of, I like that kind of sort of philosophical stuff, and I like the brevity of it.
If you were going to think about this and reflect on the idea of in the zone is what you bring to it, and then for some reason it seems connected to me to the scene where the camera pulls back and they're sitting there, and it's as though the camera's pulling back and we are there, we're in the room which you never see. But I have this feeling, but that we're in the room, like we are, it is what you bring to life. It's that the zone is our everyday existence, so what you bring to it. Does that make sense? It's what always like that, what we bring to our everyday, our existence. Maybe what he's saying, that we, and not, I don't know, those things connected to me. That idea and that scene where it's as though we're in the room.
Sure thing. I mean, this is one of the many ways in which the film is so inexhaustible. I think the book was in the proof, and I was just checking something, watching the film, watching that sequence where they're on the threshold of the room and they've decided not to go in, a long sequence. Then I looked at the next bit, and I looked and I thought, shit, where has the camera gone? And only at that late stage did I notice the camera has gone into the room, where it's as though we're looking out of the room. So, whose deepest wish has been realised? The cameras, cinemas, ours, yeah. So, I mean, absolutely, technically that's going on. But also it's what, it's one of the, it's almost like the cliche bit of wisdom, isn't it? The test of what you really want from life is probably what you're actually doing. It's one of the things I end up sort of grappling with at the end of the book, where I conclude that, what would I most like to be doing? It turns out what I'd most like to be doing is sitting here at my desk writing about Stalker. The problem is with these things, it's not that kind of, thing where, it's like this thing, these things are always incremental, aren't they? It's not that there's this one thing that you want once. It's actually trying to keep track of what you most want is a job of 70 years worth of living. It's not a momentary thing.
Yeah,
Oh,
well,
sorry.
I was just wondering, with reference both to the Libya piece and also to the movie, about courage or bravery. I may wonder what the two things have to do with each other, but just that when you watch the movie, you're, at least I'm worried that they're going to get shot.
Yeah.
And so there's not just an internal discouragement continuing, but also when Ryder keeps having to go first, he doesn't like it because he's you know, and the camera's so good at giving you the feeling that he's going to get shot. And when you were in Libya, it was scary. And no.
Did I say it's scary in the book?
And when I read the essay, it's just that nobody else is there.
Yeah.
And it's very isolated, and you don't. I read it a long time ago, so I may not be remembering accurately, but it seems that I remember things that at least a little bit scary. And hearing you speak, you've done other adventurous things in your reporting, early on, and you have a kind of skepticism about motives, and that doesn't seem to go to square that easily with being courageous. So I was wondering if you could speak about the place of courage and reflection.
Great. I love the way that in the course of sitting here, I've turned into Dexter Filkins or Evan Wright, one of those great reporters from Iraq or something. Because actually, I read those. There's all the kind of writing I'm reading now. There's what I'm most into is reporting, and the kind of incredible courage of Dexter Filkins, that stuff that he's doing, in his book, The Forever War. He's with the Marines. He's in situations of incredible danger, and as we know from the kind of things that, or Sebastian Junger in that book, it's called War, isn't it? Yeah, or in the film Restrepo about. So that takes courage. Nothing I've done has ever required any physical courage. And just to go back to Libya, yeah, I was there on my own. People didn't go to Libya because of all sorts of diplomatic things. Also because it's a bit of a shithole, really. That's why people didn't go there. There was not a single moment in Libya when I felt even remotely threatened. I was irritated a lot by people coming up to me because it was so unheard of for somebody to be in Libya on their own. I'd been in Algeria on my own, where I was hitchhiking, and the only, what did I experience there? I experienced this slightly tiresome nature of this sort of, the constant offers of hospitality. And one of the things I'm really struck by is that the more you travel the world, the more places you go, the more I'm struck by. I'm not totally naive. I wasn't going to suddenly go on holiday to Grozny back in the day. I wasn't going to go to Fallujah for within certain. But generally, with those sort of, it's just incredible how broadly nice people are in the world. The lesson of travel is so simple that actually people are amazingly nice the world over, especially. They're staggeringly nice, given the enormous disparities of wealth, isn't it? Isn't it just amazing that you don't get robbed and mugged the whole time? You can hardly blame people for doing so. So yeah, I've just had this. I think it must be so. There's a student I'm teaching, and I like him so much. He's from Kansas, and in town when he was about 18, he's a big guy. He got set upon randomly by 4 people, and they really beat him up, and he's got his nose all messed up. And the great thing about him is he's got this fantastic, he's cautious walking around, but it hasn't traumatized him to the extent that he thinks, the world is a horrible, nothing really, I got mugged when I lived in Brixton. That was primarily an economic transaction, as I sort of wrote at the time. It was more like begging by force, really. And it's but it's really the world doesn't seem to me a scary place at all. And also, I'm always aware that I do have at my command that most efficient form of kung fu, good manners. It gets you out of many Anyway, but yeah. But I'm really not naive. I know there are certain places that you don't go, that you would be foolish to go. But yeah, most people would no more think of harming you than you would think of harming them. Om Shanti. Yeah, I just unblocked several chakras there.
Well, on that lovely note, in favor of etiquette, please join me in thanking Geoff Dyer once again.